Back in the late 1990s, my husband and I took a trip out west from Michigan to visit our daughter, who was living in Douglas, Wyoming at the time. At one point, we stopped at a restaurant and gift shop on the high plains in Nebraska. The route we were on in western Nebraska matched very closely for a short while the route of the old Pony Express, which went from St. Joseph, Missouri, which is about 300 miles northwest of St. Louis, on the Missouri River near the intersection of Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska, across the plains and mountains to Sacramento, California. Most of the mail carried by the express riders was actually headed ultimately to San Francisco. It was transferred at Sacramento from those Pony Express riders to a steamboat that took it the final stretch down the Sacramento River to San Francisco. Occasionally, if a steamer was missed, riders would continue on and deliver the mail to Oakland, just across the San Francisco Bay from San Francisco. I don't think the restaurant we stopped at during our trip west was on the exact spot of a Pony Express station, but the Pony Express was obviously a hot topic in the area, and the gift shop played upon the Pony Express connection as a tourist attraction, with Pony Express-themed souvenirs such as these. That was the first place I ever saw this Pony Express replica poster. I'd heard about the Pony Express in passing since my childhood in the 1950s. It was part of the lore of the Old West that showed up in passing in pop culture, such as B-Western movies, cowboy comic books, TV westerns, and so on. But I'd not actually ever read any formal history of the institution. Thus, I was shocked when I saw that poster. I'd always pictured Pony Express riders the way I'd seen them portrayed in movies and on TV. Like the Charlton Heston movie posters seen here from 1953, that seemed to imply Heston was playing a Pony Express rider in the movie. Yes, in movies they were always depicted as mature, tall, husky, macho guys in their 30s or 40s. So what was all that on the poster about skinny and wiry and orphans and under 18? By the time I got back from that trip, I'd forgotten all about the poster. And it was years later when I finally did think to Google the history of the Pony Express. The first thing I learned was that this historical poster reproduction that I'd seen was actually a historical fiction item. Although the poster shows up all over the internet, it seems that it is not a direct reproduction of any actual document remaining from the heyday of the Pony Express. It is evidently a faux poster. But the second thing I learned was that the information on the poster wasn't all that far from accurate in depicting the nature of the Pony Express. More on that later in this video. The third thing I learned was that I had entertained for my whole life a false notion that the Pony Express was a major feature of American life of the second half of the 19th century. I never thought through how long it may have been in business, but I'd been left with the impression that it had been around for, say, 30 or 40 years. Instead, I learned that it lasted a total of barely 19 months. As mentioned at the top of this souvenir postcard, the first riders headed out on their cross-country trip in April 1860, and the last ones in October 1861. And in fact, teams of relay riders had traveled the whole route for barely 11 months. For the final 8 months, they were only making trips from Salt Lake City, Utah to Sacramento. 19 months? How on earth did the institution get such a major and enduring reputation based on a run of only 19 months? We'll revisit that question after we sort through some of the established historical facts about the Pony Express. In the early 1840s, communicating all the way across the U.S. from the East Coast to the West wasn't that urgent a matter. Not that many people back east needed to contact anyone in the area that is now the state of California. It was sparsely populated and belonged to Mexico. I'm guessing most of the inhabitants at the time were people originally from Mexico mixed in with indigenous peoples native to the region. There were a few Americans who had settled in the area, but not enough to make communications back east a high priority. All that changed quickly after the U.S. annexed the area of Texas in 1845, triggering the Mexican-American War that ran from April 25, 1846 to February 3, 1848. The U.S. prevailed in that conflict, and as a result, Mexico ceded vast areas of the west and southwest of the U.S., including California. On February 2, 1848, California became a part of the U.S. with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Under normal conditions, land newly acquired by the U.S., such as this, would spend a considerable number of years as a territory, until its population of American citizens gradually grew to 60,000 or more when it could petition to become a state in the Union. It's estimated that just before the treaty, in January 1848, the population of non-native people in California was only 7,000, added to 150,000 or so indigenous peoples. So you'd think it would have stayed a territory for a good long time. But all that changed very quickly. On January 24, 1848, less than 2 weeks before the treaty, gold was discovered in California on property owned by Swiss immigrant pioneer John Sutter, nearby his new water wheel-powered sawmill under construction there. Although those aware of the discovery tried to keep the situation hush-hush, by March the news had hit the local newspapers and was beginning to spread. Here's how one San Francisco paper addressed the find at the time. In the newly made raceway of the sawmill recently erected by Captain Sutter on the American Fork, gold has been found in considerable quantities. One person brought $30 worth to New Helvetia, gathered there in a short time. California, no doubt, is rich in mineral wealth. Great chances here for scientific capitalists. Gold has been found in almost every part of the country. It took a while for the news to reach the east coast of the U.S., but in the midst of the annual speech to Congress by President James K. Polk in December that year, while he waxed eloquent about the great results of the war with Mexico in terms of manifest destiny, he enthusiastically announced publicly that gold in great abundance had been discovered in the newly acquired land of California. A newspaper of the time, shown here, summarized the contents of Polk's speech that addressed the discovery of California gold. The president comments on the annexation of Texas, says the acquisition of California is as important as Louisiana. San Francisco predicted to be a great city. He alludes to this discovery of the rich mines of gold, the account of which is sustained by evidence of officers of the Army. The commanding officer has visited the gold regions and reports the supply very large in extensive districts of the country. In July last, 4,000 persons were engaged in collecting gold. The numbers have since been increased. Mines of quicksilver have also been found, one of which is the most productive in the world. These discoveries, he thinks, will produce a revolution in the affairs of California. Labor was exorbitant. Soldiers and sailors had deserted. Soldiers without increased pay could not be kept on duty. He suggests that a branch mint in California would attract gold from the neighboring countries in Mexico and the west coast of South America. And thus you end up with the gold rush of 1849 with its miner 49ers coming from all over the eastern U.S. and even from far-flung lands to the west like China and Australia. And other 49ers came who weren't looking to get rich on gold, but instead entrepreneurs looking to get rich on providing goods and services to the gold seekers. In the end, those were the folks who actually did prosper the most. As word quickly spread, the area around Sutter's sawmill was overrun by gold miners, and a gold mining camp was born. It soon became a new town named Coloma. By the summer of 1848, some 80,000 miners had flooded the area, spreading up and down the length of the Sacramento Valley, and Coloma was booming, with 300 frame buildings and a large hotel under construction. It was the first place fortune seekers headed when they arrived in San Francisco until gold was discovered in surrounding areas. The town was thriving, but the local prices for goods were outrageous because of its remote location and the rules of supply and demand. Picks and shovels went for $50 apiece, equivalent in buying power to almost $2,000 in 2022. And the same thing happened 120 miles to the west in San Francisco. No, there wasn't gold to be panned for there, but it was the landing port for people on ships rushing to the gold rush by sea from all over. And San Francisco was their first stop on their way to the gold fields. Listen to this description of the city at that time. San Francisco during the gold rush was a society and economy like no other in America. Before 1849, San Francisco was a sleepy town of barely 500. By the end of 1849, it was bursting at the seams with 25,000 residents. Such a rapid, radical transformation meant that living quarters were at a premium. In one example, a lot of land that cost $23,000 in 1848 was sold for $300,000 the next year. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $11 million in modern currency. And food, some of it sent by sailing ships from the East Coast all the way around the Horn of South America, some of it a rare local product, was also in high demand. One egg could cost $3, worth over $100 in 21st century prices. Although San Francisco got its start as a result of the gold rush of 1849, it had a lot more going for it as a focal point for fantastic growth in California, and 170 years later, it is a thriving metropolis approaching 1 million people. Coloma, however, had nothing going for it except for that gold rush that died out all too soon. In 2022, Coloma still exists, but is mostly a ghost town tourist attraction in the 21st century. There are barely 500 actual local residents. What buildings that are left are either crumbling like these 49er cabins, or reconstructed to serve as gold mining era museums or as tourist accommodations, such as the Sierra Nevada Hotel shown here in the olden days and is now refurbished and billed as a haunted hotel and restaurant. That's a photo of Sutter's Mill from 1850 on the left. A reconstruction of the building on the right and below now stands on the original site as an historical tourist attraction. In the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian in Washington, you can see this tiny piece of yellow metal called the Marshall Nugget. It may look large in the photo here, but that's an illusion of magnification. It actually is barely 1/3 inch wide by 1/4 inch tall and as thin as a chip of paint. It's believed to be the first piece of gold discovered in 1848 at Sutter's Mill in California that launched the gold rush. A man named James Marshall was superintending the construction of Sutter's sawmill on January 25, 1848. He saw something very small but brightly glittering in the stream of water flowing out from under the mill. According to Sutter's diary, Marshall stooped down to pick it up and found that it was a thin scale of what appeared to be pure gold. Marshall bit the metal as a test for gold. In June of 1848, Sutter presented that scale of gold to a representative of the U.S. government. In August of that year, this piece and other samples of California gold were delivered to President James K. Polk. Within weeks, President Polk formally declared to Congress that gold had been discovered in California, and the rush was on. The trek to the California gold fields from New York was 3,000 miles, less for those coming from points west such as Chicago or St. Louis. Some of both kinds of 49ers may have traveled across country by wagon to get to the hoped-for promised land of California. They would have taken rugged routes such as the Oregon Trail and California Trail that pioneers and immigrants were using to go west. But that would have been a very arduous way to travel, especially dealing with snowstorms and crossing mountains. Many would have likely chosen to take a less risky mode of transportation. Sailing ships. The ships would have been particularly better suited for the needs of those entrepreneurs who had plans to lay in large inventories of everything from Levi's jeans to pickaxes to sell to miners, and such things as furniture and stoves and window glass to outfit saloons and brothels and homes in the boomtowns that sprung up in the area. But it wasn't a quick trip by any means. A standard sailing trip from New York to California took you south down a route along the east coast of South America all the way to Cape Horn, at the southern tip of Chile, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet. It then went north back up the west coast to California for a total trip of 13,000 miles. That trip was taking as long as 6 months or more in 1847. This map also shows a shorter alternate route, which relied on use of the Panama Canal. But the canal wasn't completed until 1914, so it would not have been available in 1847. But before 1914, there was another alternate route to get from New York to California. It would be only 5,200 miles. A ship could go south from New York, around Florida to make a stop at New Orleans, then head back out into the Gulf, pass by Cuba, and head south to the east side of the Isthmus of Panama. Just to be clear, Panama was not an independent country yet, but part of what was called the Republic of Colombia. The main city in the area was Panama City, located on the west coast of the isthmus, a city which had been in existence since the 1500s. This route involved traveling by ship to the east coast of the isthmus on the Atlantic Ocean. But before the canal was constructed, travelers would have to get off their ship at this point. They would then have to use alternative methods of travel to cross the 60 miles or so to the west coast on the Pacific Ocean, where hopefully another ship was waiting to take them the rest of the way to California. Sounds like a good deal to cut almost 8,000 miles off the trip. And as you see on this poster, you were promised it would take barely 1 month, getting you quickly to the gold fields to stake your claim to your fortune. Between 1848 and 1869, the year the first transcontinental railroad was completed in the U.S., about 375,000 took this route from New York to California, and 225,000 took it from California to New York. But it was that 60 miles across land between the Atlantic and the Pacific that made the trip not quite as convenient as one might think. In 1855, construction on a railroad was completed that covered the route in about 4 hours. But in 1848, when the gold rush brought many people to the east coast of the isthmus wanting to get to California, there was no fast train to hop on. Instead, the 60-mile trip took 5 or 6 days at best. More about that later. Let's take a short side trip to look at the beginning attempts to make the voyage to the gold fields quicker. That effort involved, in particular, a new type of transoceanic vessel, the steamship. These were sort of like a sailing ship with the addition of steam engines that propelled giant paddles, a huge version of the steamboats on the Mississippi. By the time of the gold rush, these ocean vessels had been around for about 20 years. The following material about the adventures of traveling to California on these steamships in the gold rush era is condensed from a Panama history website. Early in 1848, Congress authorized the organization of 2 steamship lines to transport U.S. mail between New York and San Francisco. The first company was the U.S. Mail Steamship Company, which made steamship trips between New York, Charleston, Savannah, Havana, Cuba, New Orleans, Chagres, now the location of the city of Colon on the east coast of Panama, and then returned to New York. The second company was the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which ran from Panama City to San Francisco, then on another 750 miles north to Astoria, Oregon, and back to San Francisco. All these steamships also carried passengers. In October of 1848, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company's new steamship, the SS California, sailed from New York, where it had been built, around the Horn to San Francisco, where it was to be stationed. This ship was equipped with 250 berths for passengers, and most of them were empty on that first trip. The few passengers on board for this trip had destinations in South America, with the last passengers planning to get off in Callao, Peru. Once it reached California, the steamship California was scheduled to regularly travel just the route from Oregon and California to Panama City and back about once every 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the United States Mail Steam Line had ordered the construction of several steamships for the Atlantic side of this venture. Since the shipyards failed to deliver the first of these ships on time, they had to lease a small steamer, the Falcon, with sleeping accommodations for 129 passengers for this purpose. The Falcon left on its maiden voyage from New York on December 1, 1848, with only 29 passengers. The passengers were mostly U.S. government employees and missionaries planning to get to California via the Isthmus route. Note the date the Falcon departed for California, December 1st. This was just 4 days before President Polk publicly announced the discovery of gold in California on December 5, 1848. By the time the Falcon docked in New Orleans, the word was out about the gold in California, and there were 178 gold seekers waiting on the docks to board her for the ship trip to Chagres. They all stormed on board over the protest of the captain and refused to get off. The captain, intimidated by the heavily armed men, agreed to add additional beds in every nook and cranny he could find. He also was required to take on more supplies to feed this army of passengers. So the ship, intended for 129 passengers, now had over 200. The Falcon sailed out of New Orleans on December 19, 1848, and within a few days more ships were chartered and pressed into service. This included 3 steamships and 3 sailing ships. Within a week, all of these ships were on the way to Chagres, overloaded with passengers who were headed to the California gold fields. The Falcon arrived in Chagres first. It was not able to anchor near the town because there were reefs and sandbars at the mouth of the Chagres River that prevented deep-holed ships from entering the river. They had to anchor off the coast, and passengers had to pay for native boatmen to shuttle them and their belongings between the Falcon and the town of Chagres. Some of the crew also abandoned the ship, and thus 212 rowdy gringos upset the tranquility of the sleepy town, demanding transportation up the river. The mad rush was on to cross the isthmus to board the first ship to San Francisco. In order to get to Panama City on the Pacific coast and board a ship there for California, the travelers and their belongings had to first be taken by natives in canoes for 45 miles up the Chagres River to the town of Las Cruces. They then had to get out and travel by mule across land for the final 18 miles to get to Panama City. When the Falcon arrived in Chagres, there were nowhere near enough canoes available to transport all of the travelers to Las Cruces. The canoes were constructed of a large, single, hollowed-out log and averaged about 25 feet long and 3 feet wide. They were normally used just to bring bananas downriver for trade, and were all equipped with a palm leaf canopy to protect them from the hot tropical sun. Each canoe was only able to carry about 4 to 6 passengers and a crew of 3 to 4 boatmen. The going rate was about $1 per passenger plus tips for the fastest canoes. 2 days after the arrival of the Falcon, the second steamship arrived at Chagres. Within a couple of more days, all the other ships were arriving, adding to the confusion and the number of impatient gringos. Yes, by then there were over 1,000 angry gold seekers waiting for transportation up the river. Since it was a 3 to 4 day journey, they had to make stops to eat, sleep, and rest. They stopped in the towns along the bank of the Chagres, which were not prepared for the large mass of travelers. Every native hut in town was converted into a hotel, adding extra hammocks to accommodate the travelers, and the demand for food soon began depleting local food supplies. This only served to anger the late arrivers, since the quality of the food to be purchased became worse and less. Eventually, the inhabitants of these towns became better prepared for the needs of the travelers, but the prices went sky high. After the canoes unloaded their passengers at Las Cruces, 3 to 4 days later, they returned to Chagres. The boatmen were all tired from the trip and wanted to rest, but were forced, mostly at gunpoint, to make the trip again and again to carry everybody to Las Cruces. By the time the last of the passengers were transported upriver, the fare had risen from $1 to about $15 per passenger. By November of 1851, the fare had gone up to $50 per person. Passengers wanting to arrive at the California gold fields before everybody else paid a premium for boats. Those passengers who didn't want to wait for a canoe or pay a high price walked up the river on jungle paths near the banks. They had no idea what was involved walking through the jungle. When warned by the natives, they refused to believe them and continued anyway. But very soon, the mosquitoes, bugs, snakes, crocodiles, and other wildlife in the tropical jungle terrified them. As they started to realize the hazards of the journey, a couple of days later, they migrated to the riverbanks, hoping to catch a ride on one of the boats going upstream. These, whenever they found a boat willing to pick them up, paid 2 and 3 times the normal fare. At Las Cruces, the travelers made use of the old Spanish gold road that had been around since the 1500s. Although it had been neglected for over 100 years, it still existed. There, they hired mules for the trip to Panama City. Again, the early arrivers at Las Cruces were the first to hire mules and made the trip first. It normally took about 1 day to travel the 18 miles to Panama. Initially, the mules cost $1 per rider for the trip. Within a couple of weeks, the price had risen to $10 per person and 10 cents per pound of luggage. Here is where they were headed, Panama City as it looks today. It's now a bustling metropolitan area of over 1 million people. But of course, that's not what it looked like back in 1848. It looked more like this. When those first gold rush travelers arrived, there were approximately 1 dozen hotels, and these quickly overfilled. Within a short time, all of the aristocratic old homes were being converted to inns, renting every spare room in the house. Within weeks, there were so many people in the city that every available bed was taken up, although it was possible to rent a place to sleep on the floor in the city slums for $2 a night. Many travelers ended up sleeping in the city's parks. Since many future gold miners brought tents with them to use in California, a large tent city grew overnight outside the city. So there they were, eventually thousands of restless gold seekers, all waiting on the Pacific coast for a ship to come take them to the gold fields. The wait was longer than they expected because the first available ship was going to be the steamship California, making its way slowly up the Pacific coast of South America. And unknown to the waiting crowds, that steamship only had sleeping accommodations for 250 people. When the California arrived in Callao, which is now part of Lima, Peru, instead of her last passengers disembarking, the news of the California gold strike had already reached Peru, and 100 Peruvians had purchased tickets for the trip to California. Most of the passengers originally destined for Callao decided not to get off there either, but continue on to California also. So over 100 passengers were on board when the California left Callao. In modern times, the trip from Callao to Panama City by direct plane flight would be about 1,300 miles and would take about 3.5 hours. But of course, the route by sailing ship was a lot more miles, and at a speed of about 10 miles per hour, it would take a week or so for the same trip. By the time the California reached Panama on January 17, 1849, the passengers from the Falcon had been in Panama close to 3 weeks, waiting for transportation to California. All hell broke loose when all those waiting for a trip to California realized there were sleeping accommodations on the ship for only a small portion of them. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company's agent allowed the few waiting travelers on board who had a direct ticket from New York to San Francisco to join the 100 Peruvians on board already, leaving only 150 openings left. But most of those waiting didn't have a ticket already. They expected to be able to buy one when they reached Panama City. The agent offered to put everyone's name on a hat and draw names for the remaining berths. But that would leave hundreds stuck in Panama, and thus the frustrated travelers rioted. They insisted that as U.S. citizens, they had priority on all travel on U.S. ships, and the Peruvians should be pushed out. The agent refused this illegal demand. The Peruvians, scared that if they got off the ship they would be refused reboarding or murdered on land, refused to leave the ship during the 2 weeks it was anchored off the coast. The Peruvians eventually agreed to be doubled and tripled up in the staterooms, and more bunks were added. The California finally steamed out of Panama on January 31st, 1849, with 365 passengers, 165 more than what she was designed for, but many hundreds were left stranded in Panama. Many days and 3,000 miles later, the California was passing the southern tip of Mexico's Baja California Peninsula. With over 1,500 miles to go yet to get to San Francisco, the ship ran out of coal to run the steam engine and had to resort to burning every spare item made of wood on the ship. Beds, tables, chairs, and decks were ripped out and burned to produce steam. By the time the ship arrived in San Francisco, there were no more wood items to burn. On February 28, 1849, the California passed through the Golden Gates and became the first ship to disembark the first load of gold seekers in California. When she docked in San Francisco and discharged her passengers, every crew member on board also left the ship to go and seek their fortune in the gold fields. This left the captain without a single crew member, and it took him 3 months before he had enough of a crew to steam back to Panama. This painting of San Francisco Harbor as it looked in 1849 shows 16 of the earliest gold rush ships to arrive, all of them high and dry on the mudflats off Yerba Buena Cove on a receding tide. In the center you can see the steamship California, which was lying stranded, waiting for the wooden parts of the ship to be repaired or replaced that had been burnt for fuel, and also awaiting a new supply of coal before it could head back to Panama. On February 23rd, the second Pacific Mail steamer, the Oregon, a sister ship to the California, arrived in Panama. It didn't help a whole lot. It could only fit 300 on board for the trip to San Francisco, leaving hundreds still stranded. Reaching San Francisco, the Oregon dropped anchor right beside the California and saw the plight of that steamer without a crew to return to Panama. Its captain quickly announced to his crew that all wages for the mariners were being raised by a factor of 10. He simply added a 0 to the end of all posted wages, so only a small number of his crew left for the gold fields, and there were enough remaining to return to Panama. Returning to Panama, he found the third sister ship, the steamship Panama, taking on more frantic passengers. It took the 3 side-wheelers of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company another 4 months before they could catch up with removing all the stranded travelers and develop a steady routine back and forth to San Francisco. This is a photo of San Francisco Harbor in 1849, not long after the time of the fiasco involving the steamships from Panama. The harbor was crowded with nearly 700 abandoned sailing ships from all over the Pacific. Gold fever was running at such a high pitch at the time that when a vessel came into port, many sailors jumped ship even before the anchor had dropped. Remember that non-native population in California of 7,000 people in January 1848? By the end of 1848, it was 20,000. Still a very sparse population, nowhere near the 60,000 expected before a new kid on the block like California could be expected to apply for statehood. But as the gold rush continued, by the end of 1849, it had mushroomed to 100,000. And by January 1853, it had skyrocketed to 300,000. By 1851, anyone arriving to seek their fortune had found themselves in the brand new state of California. Because eager to tap into the great possibilities for wealth and prosperity promised by the gold rush, the U.S. Congress had fast-tracked California's quest to become a state by rewriting the requirements for statehood. Thus, on September 9, 1850, California became the 31st state, skipping entirely over the process of becoming a territory first. They needn't have worried about having enough population. Yet with all that population explosion, there still was no regular, quick, efficient means of communication from California to back east, which would be important if California was to become an active part of the nation, including in its politics. In 1841, it had taken 110 days for the news of the death of President William Henry Harrison to reach Los Angeles, probably being passed along haphazardly across the continent via a hodgepodge of stagecoaches and wagons. And by the early 1850s, the circumstances were not much better. This was a major inconvenience for many businesses, as well as for matters of government. This became particularly significant in relation to such things as national elections, and even more critical in the time leading up to the Civil War. The telegraph had been invented in the 1840s, and telegraph communications spread quickly throughout the eastern U.S., usually connected to railroad routes. The young railroad industry grew quickly also, with 9,000 miles of track by 1850. But it and the associated telegraph lines had not yet crossed the country by 1860. It would be 1869 before a transcontinental railroad was completed. With no telegraph yet, and with no efficient method of transporting mail quickly across the land, California was cut off from effective integration with the rest of the country. And that brings us back to that faux poster we saw at the beginning of this video. Because into this gap in 1860 stepped the company of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, with a plan to speed mail across the country via a relay system of horseback riders. Messages could be transported by train and transmitted by telegraph only as far west as St. Joseph, Missouri. Russell, Majors, and Waddell created the Pony Express to take those messages from St. Joseph and transport them to San Francisco in record time. William Russell was a lone wolf, an optimistic risk-taker, and although he was the political brains behind the operation, he often clashed with his partners. Alexander Majors was a farmer who got stuck in Russell's craw because his success as an overland freighter on the Santa Fe Trail made him a formidable competitor. William Waddell managed the new company, while his partners spent most of their time on their own businesses. They dubbed their brainstorm the Pony Express. Yes, the Pony Express actually used ponies, But at the time, the word pony didn't mean the kind of particular breeds of small horses which we usually mean by the term pony today. Back then, it just meant a quick and handy riding horse of average size. Besides, the term horse express just wouldn't have had the catchy sound of Pony Express. A True West magazine article on the history of the Pony Express explains some details about those ponies. The company bought the best horses money could buy. Kentucky thoroughbreds for the flat prairie, Mustangs for the rugged western terrain. They needed great horses for two reasons: speed and safety. The express riders were alone. They had to be able to outrun bandits and hostile Indians. While saddle horses in 1860 were going for $50, the Pony Express paid from $150 to $200 per mount. The Pony Express mail was carried in a type of leather pouch called a mochila, a Spanish word for pouch or backpack. It was a rectangular piece of leather with a pocket called a cantina attached to each of its corners. The mochila would be thrown over the saddle and held in place by the weight of the rider sitting on top of it. Bundles of letters were placed in 3 of the cantinas, the rider's time card in the 4th. Each was padlocked for safety. A mochila could carry 20 pounds of mail. I have read that the Pony Express Company put great stress on the importance of the pouch and were known to declare that if it came down to it, the horse and rider should perish before the mochila did. I'm not sure if the riders all bought into that prime directive, but they no doubt took great care with their handling of the mochila. Riders were not allowed to weigh any more than 125 pounds. This pretty much compares with racehorse jockeys today, who are limited to 120 pounds or less. Beyond the weight of a saddle, the average pony was not expected to carry more than 165 pounds. The Pony Express rider and his mochila would weigh 145 pounds, so that limited any extra items to be brought along to a total weight of 20 pounds. Thus, each rider was pretty much limited to bringing along a water sack, a small horn, a revolver, and a Bible. A Bible? Why would a pony rider need a Bible? Alexander Majors, one of the founders of the Pony Express, was a devout Christian who believed adversities could be overcome with God's help. So he insisted on providing Pony Express riders with a Bible each and instructed them to read passages daily. A leather-bound edition of the King James Bible, published by the American Bible Society expressly for use by the Pony Express, was very compact, at about 5.7 inches tall, 3.6 inches wide, and a little over 2 inches thick. Note the inscription on the front cover says that the Bible is from 1858, 2 years before the start of the Pony Express. That's because before the Pony Express, Russell, Majors, and Waddell had run a wagon train business for a time, and the Bibles were originally printed to give to the wagon train employees. In addition, inside the front cover of each Bible was a page with a printed oath that each rider had to recite and then sign on the page in writing before setting out to deliver mail. It read this way: I do hereby swear before the great and living God that during my engagement and while I am an employee of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, I will under no circumstances use profane language, that I will drink no intoxicating liquors, that I will not quarrel or fight with any other employee of the firm, and that in every respect I will conduct myself honestly, be faithful to my duties, and so direct all my acts as to win the confidence of my employers, so help me God. Sounds really pious, but as you might guess, most Pony Express riders likely didn't take the oath seriously. In 1860, famous international British explorer Sir Richard Burton, who had many adventures all over Asia, Africa, and the Americas, went on an expedition to study the Mormons of Utah, where he visited with Mormon prophet Brigham Young. Burton wrote a book titled The City of Saints, describing his experiences. His route to get out to Salt Lake happened to coincide with the route of the Pony Express, and thus he included in his book descriptions of stopping at inns along that route that were next to Pony Express stations. He rubbed shoulders with numerous Pony Express riders, and in the book he noted, I scarcely ever saw a sober rider. The total length of the Pony Express route was about 2,000 miles from Missouri to California. The goal was to get a piece of mail from the start to the finish of the route as quickly as possible. The aim was to take 10 days, which would mean covering about 200 miles a day, traveling both daytime and nighttime. Obviously, neither one horse nor one rider could do that. The central idea of the Pony Express was similar to tag team relay races run by human runners. One runner, or in this case rider, would go as far as they could reasonably go, as fast as they could reasonably go, and then hand off the mail to another rider. Home stations, where riders would spend nights between their trips, were about 75 miles apart along the route. A single pony running at a full gallop could cover about 15 miles before exhaustion began to set in. So every stretch about that distance along the route, the Pony Express Company built way stations that were equipped at all times with fresh ponies. A healthy rider could be expected to be able to ride from 75 to 100 miles a day before he became exhausted too. So for instance, a rider named Bill would start out in the morning from his home station, riding his first horse of the day, headed west on the Pony Express route toward California. After the first 15 miles or so, as Bill approached the first way station on his portion of the route, he would sound his horn from a distance to let the proprietor of the station know he was coming. At the station, a fresh horse, saddled and ready to ride, was brought out to where he would ride by. Bill would gallop up to the meeting spot, jump off his pony and grab his mochila and other items he had with him, transfer them to the waiting fresh horse, and be on his way in barely 2 minutes. Bill's first horse would then be fed and watered and rested to be ready when it was its turn to be ridden again. At the end of Bill's assigned stretch of the full Pony Express route, he would hand off the mochila to a new rider, who would take it to the next stretch west. Bill would then rest up in the lodging available at or near the station and wait for a rider to come in a day or so from the west, heading back to Missouri. That rider from the west would hand off his mochila to Bill, and Bill would gallop off east, headed back to his own home station. As you can see from these photos, the building styles and materials used to make way stations were not uniform along the route. They varied widely, each reflecting the terrain and climate and natural building materials available in each location. In general, each rider was responsible for riding back and forth on the same stretch over and over again. Some stretches were more dangerous or difficult than others, especially when riding through areas inhabited by hostile Indian tribes or through very rough terrain in the mountains. The riders willing to take those stretches could receive a higher pay rate. Riders were expected to be ready to ride either all day or all night, usually in about 10-hour stretches, and, if necessary in an emergency, do double duty and ride over 20 full hours in a row. Or in the case of one heroic rider, 40 hours. In May 1860, Robert Pony Bob Haslam took off on the most legendary ride in Pony Express history. The 20-year-old was scheduled to make his usual 75-mile run from Friday's Station east to Buckland Station in Nevada. Upon arriving at Buckland, however, he found that his relief rider was petrified of the Paiute Indians, who had been attacking stations along the route. When the other man refused to take the mail, Haslam jumped back on a pony and rode on, eventually completing a 190-mile run before delivering his mochila at Smith's Creek. After a brief rest, he mounted a fresh horse and retraced his steps all the way back to Friday's Station, at one point passing a relay outpost that had been burned by the Paiutes. By the time he finally returned to his home station, Pony Bob had traveled 380 miles in less than 40 hours, a Pony Express record. Pony Bob came to the United States as a teenager and was hired by the Pony Express when he was 20. He helped build the stations and was assigned to regularly ride that 75-mile stretch in Nevada. Perhaps his greatest ride, 120 miles in 8 hours and 20 minutes, while wounded, was an important contribution to the fastest trip ever made by the Pony Express. The most important message he carried that day was a copy of the text of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address in 1861. Here's how the AmericanCowboy.com website describes that famous ride. In April 1861, with America at the brink of the Civil War, California was undecided whether to remain with the Union or support the Confederacy. While not a battleground state, California's reinforcement would be pivotal in the event of war. The side it chose would benefit from the wealth and manpower the state could provide. Abraham Lincoln had just been elected president, and his inaugural address detailed his administration's policy, which California's leaders were anxious to read. But first, it had to travel nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California. a ride that normally took Pony Express 10 days to deliver. The Express broke all speed records on that run, so urgent was the need to get Lincoln's address to California. The mochila containing Lincoln's address made it in 7 days, 17 hours, and the 8-hour ride by 20-year-old Robert Pony Bob Haslam was the most critical. He rode 13 Mustangs on his 120-mile ride through Nevada Territory, part of which traversed hostile Paiute Indian country. According to his journal, he had a running fight with warring braves for 3 or 4 miles. One of their flint-tipped arrows pierced his arm and another broke his jaw, knocking out 5 teeth. Haslam reportedly escaped by shooting their horses out from under them. Despite his injuries, he completed his leg of the express route in record time. The London, England-born Haslam rode for his life that day, but more than that, he may have ridden for the survival of our nation. Lincoln's vital inaugural address could have been delayed for weeks had Haslam not escaped the Paiutes. And without the address's mollifying effect, California might have chosen to support the Confederacy, perhaps changing the course of the Civil War. For 8 hours that day in 1861, America's fate rode with a 125-pound young man. All these details we've been examining are where you get the mention on the poster of those under 18 orphans. Not too many grizzled 40-somethings weighed 125 pounds or less. So indeed, the business did attract teenagers looking for excitement and a good-paying job. While the average worker at the time earned 50 cents to $1 a day in most unskilled jobs, the Pony Express riders were offered at least $25 a week, more if they were assigned a particularly dangerous stretch to ride. In fact, it wasn't unheard of for kids as young as 11 or 12 to run away from home and try to join the ranks. Some succeeded, especially if they had no family in the first place and were perhaps living in a foster home under rough conditions. Some riders ended up making good money and moving on to productive lives after the closing of the Pony Express business. Some didn't, including this young man, who was indeed one of those orphans who signed on to ride for the Express. Billy Tate was a 14-year-old Pony Express rider who rode the Express Trail in Nevada near Ruby Valley. During the Paiute Uprising of 1860, he was chased by a band of Paiute Indians on horseback and was forced to retreat into the hills behind some rocks, where he killed 7 of his assailants in a shootout before being killed himself. His body was found riddled with arrows, but was not scalped, a sign that the Paiutes honored their enemy. It's said that the Paiute warriors so respected Billy's bravery, especially once the battle was over and they discovered he was obviously so young, that they set his horse free, and it was so familiar with the route it regularly traveled with Billy that it made its way all on its own to the Ruby Camp Pony Express station where he was headed. When the horse showed up riderless, a search party was sent out to look for Billy. Circling buzzards led them to the scene of the battle and his body. I don't know how old Frank Webner, the Pony Express rider in this picture, was when it was taken, but by the looks of his baby face, I'd put him about Billy's age. It's hard to tell the age of some fellows in old pics of express riders. Johnny Fry, top right in this photo of 4 of the riders, was the first official westbound express rider when the service started business in 1860. And after the Express folded in 1861, he went on to serve in the Civil War. When I first saw this photo, it sure looked to me like Johnny was in his 30s. But I discovered through research that he was born in 1840 and died during the Civil War in 1863 at just age 23. So he's likely about 20 years old in this photo. He was definitely small and wiry, though. He weighed less than 120 pounds. Small and wiry is not a description you can use for Charlton Heston on the right here, about 6'3" and 200 pounds, or Forrest Tucker on the left, even taller at 6'4" and also about 200 pounds. My dad was a U.S. postal worker delivering packages and letters on a rural mail route for much of his life up to retirement in the 1980s. He drove a vehicle through snow drifts in northern Michigan, getting stuck in the snow out in the country no doubt numerous times each winter, trying to reach snowed-in mailboxes. He got up to go to work very early in the morning before dawn, since he had to sort all the mail before he could get on the road. But he certainly never had to risk his life to make sure all the clients on his route got their postcards and birthday cards from friends and family, bills, Sears catalogs, and all the rest that we all got back before email and the internet. Those wiry, lightweight men of the Pony Express literally did risk their lives over and over, riding for hours through snow and rain and other lousy weather much of the time, no doubt. Just so, for instance, some businessman in San Francisco could get some details on furniture or clothing or appliance shipments that he ordered from his counterpart in New York. For $5, later dropped to $1, you could send a 1/2 ounce letter by Pony Express. You could also send a message over the telegraph wires from New York to St. Joseph, Missouri, then have it transcribed there and transported to California by Pony Express as a letter. In California, the message would be delivered to the first telegraph station on the rider's route, which would telegraph its contents on to its destination. All that would cost you $3.45 for the first 10 words, plus whatever the telegraph companies charged you for their part in the procedure. None of this was down in the price range of the average man on the street, of course. In 2022 dollars, the $5 would be about $160. Probably not that many birthday greetings were sent via Pony Express. The service was mainly used to deliver newspaper reports of major events, government dispatches, and business documents, most of which were printed on tissue-thin paper to keep costs and weight down. So it wasn't a common method of communication, but it did do a brisk business for the times. For the 19 months that the Pony Express was in service, 308 runs were made westbound and eastbound for a total distance of 616,000 miles. A total of 34,753 pieces of mail was carried. Of that number, 18,456 pieces of mail originated in San Francisco, 4,900 originated in Sacramento. At the same time, San Francisco received 9,553 pieces of mail from the east. Sacramento received 1,844. Although the Pony Express did a lot of good for the short time it was active, it didn't do a lot of good for its owners. Throughout the whole period it was in service, the Pony Express only grossed about $90,000, which barely paid for the purchase of the horses used. By the time it went out of business, its owners took a loss of $200,000. So it's probably just as well that it didn't have to keep struggling to stay alive. The Pony Express didn't close up shop specifically because of the losses. It closed down because it was no longer needed. The first transcontinental telegraph line connecting Sacramento and Omaha, Nebraska went into service on October 24th, 1861. Other lines already connected Omaha and points east. And 2 days later, the Pony Express closed its doors. So back to that question from the early part of this video. How on earth did the institution get such a major and enduring reputation based on a run of just 18 months? Especially given the fact the company was totally unprofitable. You might say that the answer lies in its endless fictional presentation as a legend in media over the next 150 years. At first in books with plots based on the legend of the Express, which continue to be churned out even today. Some of them adventure books, aimed directly at children. And some of them romance novels, aimed directly at a certain subset of mostly adult female readers. But from the earliest years of the film industry, even while movies were still silent, it was no doubt the excitement and realism that could be presented on the silver screen that most affected the spread of the Pony Express legend to the widest audience, even to folks who weren't book readers. Here's just a taste of the way the legend was portrayed in a trailer for Heston's 1953 Pony Express movie.
Daredevil riders of the Pony Express begin their race to cut the dangerous journey across the continent from 180 days down to an incredible 10. And behind the birth of the Pony Express stood two immortal figures of the West. Buffalo Bill Cody, played by the screen's newest star, Charlton Heston, and Wild Bill Hickok, played by rugged Forrest Tucker.
Wild Bill.
You mean they do this just for fun?
It's fancier than shaking hands.
These were the two women in their life, Rhonda Fleming as Evelyn the lady, and Jan Sterling as Denny the army brat. You'll see all the spectacular chapters of the story that was the glory of the frontier, the Pony Express forerunners in the wild stampede for safety.
They're gonna give that express rider a big hello. That express rider's gonna get there before they think. He's gonna need some cover.
The Battle of the Truckee River Station, key to success for the Pony Express.
I think most folks would agree that the Pony Express became that legend perpetuated in American society generation after generation because it was such a unique, brash undertaking and fit so well into the romance of the Old West that its story was easily adapted as fodder for books and paintings, and eventually motion pictures and TV. Oh, not the real story of the Pony Express, the hyped-up, glamorized version introduced by the dime novels of the turn of the century. The reality was quite different, as told in this article from Wild West magazine in 2006. The Pony Express was short-lived and its financial collapse essentially ruined its backers. If Russell, Majors, and Waddell left significant records, those have never been discovered. One explanation is simply they did not keep many records. The other is that they destroyed whatever records they had to avoid creditors. Both Russell and Waddell died within a decade of the end of the Pony Express and never wrote a word about their exploits. Majors, an honest-to-God pioneer in Western freighting on the fabled Santa Fe Trail, survived. But Majors, a simple man who was a devout Bible reader, did not compose his memoirs until the end of the 19th century. When he did, his life story was ghost-written, or at least heavily edited, by Colonel Prentice Ingraham, a fabled dime novelist and hack. William Buffalo Bill Cody paid Rand McNally to print this hodgepodge of recollections. 70 years on the frontier, Alexander Majors' memoirs of a lifetime on the border. Majors later complained that Colonel Ingraham had taken liberties with the story. Despite the best efforts of enthusiasts, we're not even sure who exactly rode for the Pony Express. Majors said that he had 80 men in the saddle, but this was not the modern American space program. It seems plausible, and many personal anecdotes support this theory, that just about anyone could ride for the pony if they were available and the pony needed a rider. Dramatic images, and every painter in America from Frederick Remington to those who wished to be Remington painted the Pony Express, always show a rider at full gallop, pursued by Indians or desperados, such as this Pony Express painting by renowned Western artist Frank McCarthy. But the few remaining riders who were actually interviewed late in their lives seldom mentioned Indians or desperados. They always complained mostly about the weather and terrain. Understandable if you were riding a horse across western Nebraska or Wyoming in January at night in a snowstorm. Like Richard Clark here, interviewed on camera in 1929.
You want to know a little about early days? Pony Express riding was the toughest work in the bunch. If you were scouting, you could go where you pleased. But when you was riding Pony Express, you had a trail to go. And on that trail, you couldn't move. You changed horses about every 20-25 miles. Sometimes you didn't change at all, because you couldn't. Your station was taken up. Then there was times when you had to shoot. And the way we done it was this way. That's all I got. And you asked a little about this. This is how we done it. One of the toughest things was Pony Express riding. If you were scouting, you could go where you pleased. But,
Say that about the state, Pony Express riding.
Pony Express riding's tough work. You're riding all kinds of weather. And when the streams are up, you have to swim them. But the mail goes through just the same.
Those aging riders also regularly complained about their pay back in the day. In fact, the official name of the Pony Express Company, Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, was shortened to the acronym COC and PP. But many employees during the heyday of the Express regularly joked that those letters actually stood for clean out of cash and poor pay. Turns out that the owners were pretty much viewed ultimately as deadbeats, and even that fabulous $25 a week that riders were promised ended up being more fable than fact, too. Yes, it seems that the lore of the Pony Express as it made its way into the movies and TV, and even to having its own modern postage stamp, has been based a lot more on the kind of American folklore tall tales similar to Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan than on solid research. Consider this description of the very first author who introduced the lore to the American reading public. The first chronicler of the Pony Express was Colonel William Lightfoot Vischer, a peripatetic newspaperman, but not a colonel, who drifted across the American West in the late 19th century. He is, on reflection, a perfect chronicler for such a tale. He never let the facts get in the way of anything he wrote. Vischer's book, A Thrilling and Truthful History of the Pony Express, was published in 1908, nearly a half century after the Pony Express went out of business. Anyone wondering how the story of the Pony Express became muddled need only consider that it took half a century to write a book about the subject, and its author was a dubious chronicler. Much of Vischer's research appears to have been conducted at the bar of the Chicago Press Club, his legal address for many years. A terrible liar, a drunkard, a bad poet, and a rascal, Vischer bore an amazing resemblance to comedian W.C. Fields. The colonel was a delightful, if completely unreliable historian. We have no idea where he got most of his information, although he appears to have cribbed a fair bit of it from the few early attempts to set down some facts about the Central Overland. Historians of the pony, such as there have been, have always ignored this jolly old lush, who drank 2 quarts of gin a day for much of his life, but lived to be 82. So it's probably not wise to give too much credence to the authenticity of all those old movies and TV shows about the Pony Express, but they were, no doubt, entertaining. Here's one I don't remember at all. The TV series that lasted from 1989 to 1992, starring Stephen Baldwin, Josh Brolin, and Ty Miller. And there was evidently an earlier TV series on the same topic that only lasted one season in 1959. But long before that, it seems that the real boost to the popularity of the Pony Express story came in a different venue, the live Wild West show circus-style extravaganzas put on by the famous Buffalo Bill Cody. As one online writer put it, Buffalo Bill Cody is the reason Americans remember the Pony Express today. In essence, Buffalo Bill saved the memory of that enterprise. Long before there were books about the Pony Express, let alone motion pictures, Buffalo Bill's Wild West presented the Pony Express rider, a fixture in Cody's extravaganza from the day it opened in Omaha, Nebraska in 1883 until the day it closed in 1916. Not only Americans became dramatically acquainted with the Pony Express through Buffalo Bill, Europeans from penniless orphans in London, led into the show because of the kind-hearted Cody, to Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, and the Pope in Rome had the same pleasure. This poster is from a French appearance of Cody's Wild West extravaganza. Notice the Le Pony Express caption at the bottom. Part of Cody's enthusiasm for celebrating this bit of the Wild West was that in his youth, he had actually known Alexander Majors, one of the Pony Express founders. After Cody's father died, Majors gave the boy a job riding a pony or a mule as a messenger for his freight hauling firm. Never shy of embellishing his past, Cody always claimed to have ridden for the Pony Express, and ridden the longest distance, too. That claim found its way into that 1953 Charlton Heston movie about the Pony Express. Heston was supposedly playing the part of Buffalo Bill Cody. The problem with this was that William F. Cody was born in 1846, and thus would have been only 14 years old or so at the start of the Pony Express in 1860. He wasn't even called Buffalo Bill until after 1868, when at age 23 he contracted with the Kansas Pacific Railroad to kill huge numbers of buffalo to feed the railroad workers. And at 14 in 1860, he certainly wouldn't have looked like towering old Charlton in this dramatic illustration from the movie, even if he had ridden for the Pony Express, which all actual historical records indicate he did not. Forrest Tucker, shown on the right here, played a fictional version of legendary gunfighter Wild Bill Hickok in the movie. According to the film, Buffalo Bill, who was actually only 14 at the time the Pony Express began, and Wild Bill, who was born in 1836 and thus only 23 or so at the time, had a major responsibility for the establishment of the Pony Express, all of which is utter nonsense. But since many Americans get just about everything they know about history from the movies, this movie was no doubt responsible for continuing the ridiculously fictional legend of the Pony Express in the mind of the American public. Yes, Buffalo Bill, back in his heyday, may have spun yarns about the Pony Express that were very flimsily based on reality, but in doing so, he did do a great deal for the memory of the Pony Express. Without his devotion, it's unlikely anyone would remember the horseback mail service. Because of Buffalo Bill, people who did not speak a word of English knew what the Pony Express was. Even today, there are still Pony Express clubs in far-flung places like Czechoslovakia, reminders of Buffalo Bill's legwork on behalf of the fast mail. So there you have it, an almost flash-in-the-pan venture that has ended up a permanent fixture in American folklore for over 160 years. But finally, before closing, we don't want to forget to pay homage to that little-known and seldom-mentioned Pony Express venture that didn't quite work out as expected either. The Pony Express Airmail Service.